If you carry legally, you probably believe you understand the boundaries. You know where you can go, what you can do, and how to stay within the law. But imagine stepping into a place you've visited dozens of times before. Only now, without realizing it, you may be crossing into a restricted zone under a newly changed rule. Nothing about your behavior changed, but the law might have. And in that moment, the consequences don't depend on your intentions. They depend on what the law now says. So here's the question I want you to think about carefully. Do you believe expanding restrictions on where firearms can be carried actually improves public safety, or does it make it harder for responsible gun owners to stay compliant? Drop your answer in the comments below. I'm genuinely interested to see where you stand. To understand what's really going on, we have to move past the headlines and look at how firearm laws actually evolve. In Virginia, like many states, gun laws are not static. They develop over time through legislation, court rulings, and policy changes. What people are reacting to right now is not always a single sweeping ban, but rather a series of adjustments that, when viewed together, can feel like a major shift. Virginia has traditionally allowed both open carry in many areas and concealed carry with a permit. That framework hasn't disappeared overnight. However, lawmakers have increasingly focused on defining and expanding what are known as sensitive places, areas where carrying firearms is restricted regardless of permit status. These can include schools, government buildings, certain public events, and specific types of properties depending on how the law is written. In my legal analysis, the phrase "everything changed" reflects perception more than precise legal reality. But perception matters because it influences how people behave. If individuals are unsure where they can legally carry, they may either over-restrict themselves or unknowingly violate the law. Neither outcome is ideal. There is a strong constitutional argument that any law regulating firearms must align with the Second Amendment, which protects the right to keep and bear arms. However, that right has always existed alongside certain limitations. The U.S. Supreme Court, in decisions like District of Columbia versus Heller, affirmed an individual's right to possess firearms for lawful purposes, such as self-defense. More recently, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin emphasized that modern firearm regulations should be consistent with the nation's historical tradition of gun regulation. Courts would likely examine whether newly expanded restrictions in Virginia align with that historical tradition. The concept of sensitive places is not new, but how broadly it is applied can raise important legal questions. For example, restricting firearms in a courthouse is widely accepted, but extending that concept to a wide range of everyday public locations could invite constitutional scrutiny. At the same time, supporters of stricter laws argue that today's society presents challenges that didn't exist in the past. Higher population density, large-scale public events, and evolving security concerns are often cited as reasons to expand restricted zones. From that perspective, these laws are not about limiting rights, but about adapting safety measures to modern realities. From a federal versus state standpoint, it's important to understand that states like Virginia have significant authority to regulate firearms within their borders, as long as those regulations do not violate constitutional protections. This creates a patchwork system across the country, where the rules can vary significantly from one state to another. One area that deserves attention is how these laws affect everyday decision-making. A lawful gun owner may now have to think more carefully about routine activities. Going to a public event, entering a government-related space, or even traveling through certain areas could involve legal considerations that didn't exist before or weren't as clearly defined. In my legal analysis, one of the biggest risks here is not intentional misconduct, but confusion. When laws become more complex, even responsible individuals can make mistakes, and the legal consequences of those mistakes can be serious. Carrying a firearm in a prohibited area can lead to criminal charges, fines, and the potential loss of firearm rights, depending on the severity of the violation. There is also a Fifth Amendment dimension to consider in certain scenarios, particularly when it comes to how individuals respond during law enforcement encounters. While this doesn't change the core issue of where firearms can be carried, it highlights the importance of understanding one's rights and responsibilities in any legal interaction. Historically, firearm regulation has always involved balancing individual rights with public safety concerns. That balance is not fixed. It shifts over time based on legislative priorities, court interpretations, and societal views. What we are seeing now in Virginia is part of that ongoing process. Courts would likely examine not only the text of the law, but also how it is enforced. If enforcement appears inconsistent or overly broad, that could become a focal point for legal challenges. On the other hand, if the law is applied clearly and consistently, it may be more likely to withstand scrutiny. Supporters of these changes often argue that expanding restricted areas reduces the likelihood of firearms being present in high-risk environments. Critics respond that overly broad restrictions may disarm individuals in situations where they would otherwise be able to protect themselves. Both perspectives are part of a broader legal and policy debate, and both are considered when courts evaluate these issues. The political reality is that firearm laws are among the most actively debated areas of legislation. The likelihood of further changes depends on multiple factors, including election outcomes, public opinion, and ongoing court decisions. This means that what is considered the law today could evolve again in the future. From a practical standpoint, lawful gun owners are now in a position where staying informed is more important than ever. This doesn't mean reacting to every headline, but rather understanding the actual legal text and how it applies in real-world situations. Small details, such as the definition of a restricted area, can make a significant difference. In my legal analysis, the long-term implications of these changes extend beyond Virginia. Similar legal questions are being raised across the country, and court decisions in one jurisdiction can influence how laws are interpreted elsewhere. This creates a dynamic legal environment where precedent plays a critical role. There is a strong constitutional argument that clarity should be a priority in any law that affects fundamental rights. When individuals clearly understand what is allowed and what is prohibited, compliance becomes more achievable. When laws are ambiguous, the risk of unintentional violations increases. As this conversation continues, it's important to approach it with both awareness and responsibility. Understanding the law is not just about avoiding penalties, it's about ensuring that rights are exercised within the framework that exists. And ultimately, that's what this comes down to. Not fear, not assumptions, but clarity. Because when laws evolve, the most important thing you can do is stay informed, stay thoughtful, and stay within the boundaries of what is legally permitted. If you found this explanation helpful, consider subscribing for more clear, legally grounded breakdowns of topics that directly impact you, and keep the conversation going in the comments, because informed discussion is how complex issues like this are better understood. Because at the end of the day, the law doesn't just shape policy, it shapes everyday decisions. You might think this is just another legal update that doesn't really affect your daily life, but take a moment and picture this in real terms. You're driving through a familiar area, maybe heading to a place you've gone to for years. You step out of your vehicle, completely unaware that the legal status of that location may have changed. Not because of anything you did, but because the law evolved quietly in the background. That's where the real impact begins. Not in dramatic headlines, but in everyday situations where awareness and reality don't always match. So let's slow this down and really understand what's happening beneath the surface. Because when people hear that a law changed everything, what they're often reacting to is not a single rule, but a shift in how multiple legal principles are being applied at once. Virginia, like many states, operates within a structured but flexible legal system when it comes to firearms. The authority to regulate firearms primarily exists at the state level, but it is constrained by federal constitutional protections. That means lawmakers can introduce new restrictions, but those restrictions must still align with the broader framework established by the U.S. Constitution. In my legal analysis, one of the most important aspects of this situation is how the concept of location-based restrictions is expanding. Historically, certain places have always been considered off-limits for carrying firearms. Courthouses are a classic example. Schools, in many cases, have also been included. These are environments where the government has long argued that safety concerns justify stricter control. But what's changing now is not the existence of restricted places, it's the scope. The definition of what qualifies as a sensitive place is being tested and, in some cases, expanded. That's where the legal tension begins. There is a strong constitutional argument that while the government can regulate firearms in certain locations, it cannot do so in a way that effectively eliminates the right to carry in most public spaces. Courts would likely examine whether new restrictions are narrowly tailored or whether they are so broad that they undermine the practical ability to exercise a constitutional right. This brings us directly into Second Amendment doctrine. The right to keep and bear arms has been interpreted by the Supreme Court as an individual right, particularly in the landmark decision of District of Columbia versus Heller. That case established that individuals have the right to possess firearms for lawful purposes, such as self-defense within the home. However, the court also made it clear that this right is not unlimited. That's a critical point. The legal debate is not about whether regulation is allowed, it's about how far that regulation can go. More recently, in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association vs. Bruin, the court emphasized that firearm regulations must be consistent with the historical tradition of gun regulation in the United States. This means lawmakers cannot simply create new restrictions based on modern policy preferences alone. They must be able to show that similar restrictions existed historically. Courts would likely examine whether Virginia's newer restrictions fit within that historical tradition. If they do, they are more likely to be upheld. If they don't, they could face significant legal challenges. Now let's bring this back to real-world impact, because that's where this becomes more than just a legal theory. For a lawful gun owner, the biggest challenge is not necessarily the existence of the law, it's understanding it. Laws that are complex, layered, and constantly evolving create a situation where compliance becomes more difficult, even for those who are trying to follow the rules carefully. Imagine trying to navigate a system where the legality of your actions depends on specific boundaries that are not always clearly marked. One street may be fine, while another just a few blocks away may fall under a restricted category due to a nearby government building or designated area. That level of detail matters, and missing it can have serious consequences. In my legal analysis, this is where the risk of unintentional violations becomes significant. Not because people are ignoring the law, but because the law itself requires a level of awareness that goes beyond what most individuals deal with in their daily lives. And the consequences are not minor. Violating firearm laws, even unintentionally, can result in criminal charges. Depending on the situation, this could mean fines, loss of carry privileges, or even more serious legal penalties. The law does not always distinguish between intentional and unintentional violations in the way people might expect. There's also an important Fourth Amendment dimension to consider. While this law primarily deals with where firearms can be carried, any enforcement action involving law enforcement raises questions about search and seizure. Courts would likely examine whether any enforcement actions respect constitutional protections against unreasonable searches. Similarly, the Fifth Amendment can come into play in situations where individuals are questioned or detained. Understanding your rights in those moments is critical, not in a confrontational way, but in a responsible and informed manner. From a political standpoint, laws like this rarely exist in isolation. They are part of a broader national conversation about public safety, individual rights, and the role of government. The likelihood of further changes depends on a combination of legislative priorities, public opinion, and judicial review. Supporters of stricter regulations argue that expanding restricted areas reduces the likelihood of firearms being present in high-risk environments. They often emphasize prevention and public safety as the primary goals. On the other hand, critics argue that overly broad restrictions can create situations where responsible individuals are unable to protect themselves in places where threats could still exist. This perspective focuses on the practical implications of limiting access rather than the intent behind the law. Both sides present arguments that courts and lawmakers must consider, and that's what makes this issue complex. It's not a simple right versus wrong scenario. It's a balancing act. In my legal analysis, one of the most important long-term implications is how these laws shape behavior over time. When legal boundaries shift, people adjust. Sometimes that adjustment leads to greater caution. Other times, it leads to confusion or disengagement. There is also a broader question about precedent. If one state successfully expands the definition of restricted areas, other states may follow. Conversely, if courts push back and limit those expansions, it could set a standard that affects laws nationwide. Courts would likely examine not just the immediate impact of the law, but its potential to influence future legislation. That's how constitutional law evolves, not just through individual cases, but through the patterns those cases create. And through all of this, one principle remains constant. The responsibility to understand and follow the law ultimately rests with the individual. That doesn't mean the law is always easy to understand. But it does mean that awareness is essential, because in situations like this, the difference between compliance and violation is not always obvious. It can come down to details, locations, definitions, interpretations, And that's why conversations like this matter. Even as the legal language seems dense, it's essential to see the human side of these laws. Think about a family preparing for the day, caring responsibly, exercising rights they believed were secure. Suddenly, the rules change, and what was once lawful may now require more careful attention, more vigilance, and more knowledge. That's why understanding these nuances is not just an academic exercise. It directly affects everyday life for responsible gun owners. Now consider the broader constitutional context. The Second Amendment guarantees the right to keep and bear arms, but that guarantee has always coexisted with certain limitations. Courts have consistently recognized that this right is fundamental but not absolute. Historical precedent, stretching back to early firearm regulations in the colonial period, has always shaped what lawmakers could regulate and how far enforcement could extend. In Virginia, the current bill represents the latest step in this long legal continuum. There is a strong constitutional argument that overly broad restrictions could be challenged successfully, but the counterpoint is equally significant. Courts may give deference to legislatures in areas where public safety is cited as a primary concern. In my legal analysis, the balance between public safety and constitutional rights is the fulcrum upon which this debate turns. Courts would likely examine both the intent of the lawmakers and the practical effect on lawful citizens. From a federal versus state perspective, this is particularly noteworthy. While federal law establishes baseline protections, states have considerable leeway to regulate possession, carrying, and usage within their borders. That means that what applies in Virginia may differ dramatically from other states, and responsible gun owners must stay informed about state-specific restrictions. Federal oversight exists, but typically focuses on ensuring that states do not outright infringe on constitutional guarantees. Practical consequences for lawful gun owners are immediate and tangible. Carrying firearms in locations now restricted under the new law could lead to citations, confiscation, or even criminal charges. Even if your intent is purely lawful, a lack of awareness could trigger enforcement. This is why legal literacy matters. Knowing the boundaries before stepping into a situation is crucial for compliance and peace of mind. The political reality cannot be ignored. Supporters of the law argue that it is a measured approach to reducing risks in public spaces, emphasizing prevention and public safety. Critics argue that the law effectively limits a fundamental constitutional right in a way that could have wide-reaching consequences for law-abiding citizens. The likelihood of legal challenges is high, and the outcomes of these challenges will shape the future landscape of firearm regulation, not just in Virginia, but potentially nationwide. Courts would likely examine the law in terms of both precedent and practical implementation. How enforceable is it? Are citizens clearly informed about restricted areas? Does the law allow for reasonable exercise of rights without undue burden? These are the questions that will ultimately determine whether the statute withstands legal scrutiny or requires amendment. The long-term implications are profound. Laws like these influence behavior, civic awareness, and legal understanding. Citizens may adjust how and where they carry firearms, potentially changing the culture of gun ownership in subtle but lasting ways. For legal scholars and everyday gun owners alike, this represents a turning point in understanding how Second Amendment rights coexist with modern regulatory frameworks. Responsible gun ownership is not merely a personal practice. It is an engagement with the law, a continuous exercise in compliance and awareness. By educating yourself on these legal shifts, you protect not only your rights, but also the safety and trust within your community. That is why legal analysis, public discussion, and informed debate are essential. As we wrap up this breakdown, it is vital to emphasize knowing the law is not optional. Understanding where boundaries lie, what enforcement entails, and how your rights are applied in practice allows you to exercise those rights responsibly. Ignorance is never an excuse in the eyes of the law, and preparation is the only path to certainty. Now, I want to hear from you. How do you feel about Virginia's new restrictions? Are they a necessary safety measure, or do they go too far in limiting constitutional rights? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your insight is not only valuable to the discussion, but helps create a community of informed, responsible citizens. If you found this breakdown useful and want more detailed, professional legal analyses of real-world laws and proposals, make sure to subscribe to the channel, press the bell icon so you never miss an update, and join our growing community. Comment below what topic you want the next video to cover, whether it's firearm law, traffic law, or another legal issue affecting everyday life. Your participation shapes the content, ensures it remains relevant, and helps everyone stay educated and responsible. Remember, understanding the law isn't just about compliance. It's about empowerment. Stay informed, stay prepared, and exercise your rights responsibly.